The story we all know is simple. A group of English settlers lands on Roanoke Island. Their governor, John White, sails back to England for supplies. He gets delayed by a war. When he finally returns 3 years later, everyone is gone. The houses are taken down. The people have vanished. All that's left is a single word carved into a post-Croatoan. And that's where the mystery usually begins. The Lost Colony of Roanoke. It's a ghost story, a historical riddle. We imagine them starving, or carried off in a raid, or sailing into a storm. We think of them as lost, swallowed by the wilderness. But what if they weren't lost at all? What if they were found? This is the Assimilation Theory. It's not as spooky, but it's far more human. It suggests the colonists didn't vanish. They moved, they joined a local Native American community. They survived. The clue they left, Croatoan, wasn't a cryptic whisper. It was a forwarding address. To understand this, you have to forget the ghost story for a minute. You have to think about the people. There were over 100 of them, men, women, and children. They weren't soldiers or adventurers looking for gold. They were families, farmers, and artisans looking for a new life. They brought their belongings, their hopes, and their fears. And they were led by John White, a grandfather whose own daughter, Eleanor Dare, gave birth to the first English child in the Americas Virginia Dare just days after they arrived. These were real people in a desperate situation. Their settlement was in a poor spot. The soil was sandy, not great for English crops. Their relationship with some of the local tribes was tense, even violent, thanks to the actions of a previous all-male expedition. And their supplies were running low. They were completely dependent on the resupply mission that John White was supposed to lead. So White goes back to England. He promises to return quickly, but when he gets there, England is preparing for war with Spain. The Spanish Armada is coming. Queen Elizabeth I needs every available ship for the war effort. White can't get a vessel. His quick trip turns into a 3-year nightmare of waiting and worrying. Imagine being one of the colonists left behind. A few months pass, a year, then 2. Your governor is not back. The promised supplies have not arrived. Your food is gone. The corn you tried to grow didn't do well. Some of your neighbors, the Croatoan, are hostile. You are isolated, thousands of miles from home, on the edge of a vast unknown continent. Do anything where we could do, sure. Or do you make a practical decision, a survival decision? This is where the Croatoan people come in. They weren't just some random tribe. The colonists knew them. They were the people of Manteo, a native man who had traveled to England with a previous expedition. He was a friend to the English. He had learned their language. He had been baptized a Christian. His people lived on a nearby island, what we now call Hatteras Island. It was a place known to be friendly and resourceful. The colonists had already discussed this possibility. Before John White left, they agreed on a plan. If they had to move, they would carve their destination into a tree or post. If they were in distress, if they were forced to leave under duress, they would add a Maltese cross. When John White finally returned in August 1590, he found the settlement empty. But it wasn't a scene of chaos or violence. The houses had been carefully dismantled, not burned or destroyed. The heavy items were gone. The area was enclosed by a strong palisade, a defensive fence, suggesting they had time to build it and weren't overrun in a surprise attack. And there, on one of the main posts of that palisade, was the word Croatoan. There was no Maltese cross. This was not a sign of disaster, it was a message. It said, "We are okay. We went to Croatoan." White understood this immediately. He wasn't horrified by the message, he was relieved. He wrote in his journal that he was greatly joyed to see it. His next step was obvious: sail south to Hatteras Island and find his family. But fate, as it had so often in this story, intervened. A massive storm rolled in. The weather was terrible, his ship's anchor cable broke, and they almost crashed. The crew was exhausted and scared. They refused to risk the journey. With winter approaching, they forced the captain to turn back towards the Caribbean, and eventually to England. John White never saw his daughter or his granddaughter again. He died without ever knowing for sure what happened to them, but he died believing they were alive, living with the Croatoan. And that should be the end of the story. The colonists left a note, their governor found it. He just couldn't follow up. They weren't lost, they just moved. But history is rarely that neat. In the legend of a Lost Colony was far more compelling than the reality of an assimilated one. So for centuries, the story ended with a question mark, but the clues didn't stop in 1590. They kept appearing, little whispers through the decades and centuries that supported the idea that the colonists survived. Just 20 years later, the English established a new, successful colony at Jamestown, about 100 miles to the north. Captain John Smith, the famous leader of Jamestown, heard stories. He wrote that the great chief Powhatan had told him about people living among the tribes to the south. People who dressed like Englishmen lived in two-story houses with stone walls and used European tools. Powhatan claimed to have attacked them because they wouldn't join his confederacy, but he also said some survived. Another Jamestown colonist, William Strachey, wrote a more detailed account around 1612. He said that escaped native informants told him there were still survivors of the English colony. They were living with a tribe called the Peckercanic, under a chief named Ionako. They had been living peacefully for 2 decades until Powhatan, warned by his priests that a nation would rise from that area to destroy him, had them slaughtered. But Strachey's account also suggested some escaped the massacre of 7 people, 4 men, 2 boys, and 1 young woman. They fled up the Chowan River to live under the protection of another chief. These aren't ghost stories, these are colonial intelligence reports. The Jamestown settlers were actively looking for the Roanoke colonists. They believed they were out there, and they were following up on leads. The stories they'd heard weren't of ghosts, but of living, breathing people who had integrated into native society. The trail doesn't stop there. It picks up again a century later. In 1701, an explorer named John Lawson traveled through the North Carolina interior. He spent a lot of time on Hatteras Island, the land of the Croatoan. He met the Hatteras people who lived there. And he noticed something strange. He wrote that the Hatteras people claimed that some of their ancestors were white. They even had family names that sounded English. Lawson was struck by their appearance. Many of them had gray eyes, a feature unheard of among the purely native populations of the area, but common in England. He was convinced. He wrote that he had no doubt these people were descended from the Roanoke colonists. They were living right where the colonists said they would be. They remembered their English heritage. They even looked the part. This is powerful evidence. It's a first-hand account from an explorer who stumbled upon the descendants of the colony. They weren't lost, they were right there. They had simply become Hatteras Indians with English names and gray eyes. Their story wasn't one of disappearing, it was one of becoming. They had children, and their children had children, and their lineage blended into the local population. So, why did the Los narrative win? Why do we still talk about a mystery? Part of it is about the stories we liked. A colony that vanished into thin air is a fantastic tale. It has suspense, tragedy, and an unsolved puzzle. A colony that packed up and moved in with their neighbors is a story of practical survival. It's less dramatic. Another part of it is about the broader narrative of American history. The traditional story of colonization is one of conquest. Europeans arrived, and they replaced the native cultures. A story where the English colonists gave up their Englishness, gave up their settlement, and became part of a Native American tribe complicates that narrative. It shows a different kind of encounter, one based on cooperation and necessity rather than conflict. It suggests that the lines between settler and native were not always so clear. For a nation built on the idea of English dominance, the story of the first English families becoming Native American was perhaps an uncomfortable one. But in recent decades, people have started looking at the evidence again, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a history to be understood. Archaeologists and historians are focusing their attention on Hatteras Island, the place the colonists named. And they are finding things. For years, archaeologists have been digging at sites on the island, places known to be Croatoan villages. And mixed in with the Native American pottery and tools, they find European artifacts. Things like a piece of a German stoneware jug, a handle from a small metal pot, a piece of a slate writing tablet, and even part of a rapier, a type of English sword. These aren't just trade goods. They are domestic items, things that English families would have owned and used every day. And they are found not at the Roanoke settlement site, but deep inside native villages on Hatteras Island, from the exact time period the colonists would have been there. This is the physical proof. It's the stuff of their lives. A child's slate for practicing letters, a mother's pot for cooking, a man's sword for protection. These objects tell a story of 2 cultures living together, sharing space and sharing lives. The English weren't just trading with the Croatoan, they were living with them. More recently, another discovery has added a new layer to the story. Archaeologists started looking not just on the islands, but on the mainland, inland from Roanoke. Using ground-penetrating radar, they found evidence of what might be another settlement, a place now called Site the 10th. At this site, they found more English pottery, specifically a type known as Surrey Hampshire borderware, which is distinct to the Roanoke colonists and not found at Jamestown. This suggests the colonists might not have all gone to one place. Perhaps a small group went to Hatteras Island with Manteo's people, and maybe another group, perhaps a smaller, more adventurous party, moved inland seeking a better place to farm or to establish a permanent foothold. This would line up with the Jamestown accounts of survivors living in different places. It makes the story more complex. It wasn't one single move, but maybe a dispersal. The colony didn't just move, it broke apart and scattered with different groups seeking survival in different ways. This also brings us back to the human element. We can imagine the debates they must have had. Faced with starvation, they had to decide what to do. Going to Hatteras with the friendly Croatoan was the safe, logical choice. But maybe some didn't want to just be absorbed into another culture. Maybe some still dreamed of building an English town. So they split up. One group chose safety and integration, the other chose risk and independence. And what would that life have been like? Imagine an English woman, Eleanor Dare, raising her daughter Virginia in a Croatoan village. She would have learned to speak their language, to grind corn their way, to make clothes from deerskin instead of wool. Well, Virginia would have grown up with Croatoan children, knowing both the stories of her English parents and the traditions of her new home. She would have been a bridge between two worlds. Her gray eyes might have been a curiosity, a marker of a heritage that would slowly fade over generations but never completely disappear. The colonists wouldn't have just adopted a new culture, they would have contributed to it. They brought with them metal tools, which were incredibly valuable. They knew how to repair firearms. They had knowledge of European politics and trade. They would have been assets to the Croatoan community, not just refugees. It would have been a true merging of two peoples. There's also a genetic component to this search. The Lost Colony DNA Project is trying to find descendants of both the colonists and the Croatoan. They are tracing family histories and collecting DNA samples from people who have deep roots in the area and family lore that connects them to the colonists. It's incredibly difficult work. After 400 years of intermarriage and migration, finding a clear genetic signal is like finding a needle in a haystack. But it's another piece of the puzzle, an attempt to connect the past to the present through the people who are still here. So, when you put it all together, the picture that emerges is not of a lost colony. It's of a resilient one. The colonists of Roanoke faced a terrible choice. Abandoned by their own country, they chose to trust their neighbors. They left a clear message about where they were going. Later reports confirmed they had survived and integrated. But archaeological evidence shows their belongings in native villages, and local oral traditions and even physical traits suggest their lineage continued. The mystery of Roanoke isn't about what happened to the colonists. The real mystery is why we've insisted on seeing them as Lost for so long. Perhaps it's because the truth is more complicated and less romantic than the legend. The assimilation theory doesn't have ghosts or a dramatic, unknown end. It has people making hard choices to survive. It replaces a supernatural mystery with a human story of adaptation, cooperation, and the creation of a new blended identity. The colonists weren't a failure. They were pioneers in a way they never intended. They didn't found an English city, they didn't claim the land for a distant queen. Instead, they became part of the land. They became part of its people. They laid down their English identities, piece by piece, and picked up new ones. Their legacy isn't in a lost fort or a pile of ruins. It's woven into the DNA and the history of the native people of North Carolina. The word Croatoan was never the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that we are only now, after 4 centuries of telling ghost stories, finally beginning to read. The colonists of Roanoke weren't lost to the New World. They were found by it.